Hello everyone, welcome back to the Grim Dawn class examination with your host, Professor Reha. Today we are looking at the Conjurer, which is the combination of Occultist and Shaman, and the reason why this is specifically called the Conjurer is essentially because the general idea that is intended is that you focus on pets. And while you can do that, you actually have another option, and you can have a little bit of play within the pet category anyways. But first off, let's get an overview of the two broad build paths that you can really take with this particular class. The first focuses, obviously, on possession. No one's surprised. Now, again, if you're using possession, you're pretty much looking to use... You can turn to any of these abilities that don't use pets, that don't involve pets. But, unlike with the Warlock, where you generally didn't need Bloody Pox a lot of the time, in this scenario, Bloody Pox is actually a really potentially strong ability, besides its natural high amounts of strength anyways, because Bloody Pox does quite decent amounts of bleeding damage, actually gets bleeding damage increases the whole way through. Shaman has Devouring Swarm, which decreases the bleeding and vitality resistance of enemies it hits. Now, it's not a whole lot. The actual max, I think, is like 30 and 50. It's 35 and 55. So it's not a huge deal, but nevertheless, it is a vitality and bleeding resistance drop for your targets, which means that Bloody Pox, which does both vitality and bleeding damage throughout its natural life, the whole way through, it gets some poison damage at the end, but it's mostly vitality bleeding. Devouring Swarm is fantastic. You throw out a Bloody Pox, you throw out a Devouring Swarm or two to make sure all enemies' resistances are down, and then watch as they drop like flies. It's pretty fun. It's a great time. But beyond those abilities up here, and again, Bloody Pox is very potent here, and obviously Devouring Swarm, but you've also got the Grasping Vines, which does bleeding. It does some physical, which is fine. It does some vitality here. You've got the Wendigo Totem, which does vitality. It does some bleeding later on. You can convert Storm Totem into vitality damage, although with this, quite frankly, with, Wendigo Totem, there's not much point in doing that. You can. It's an option. I'll just put that out there. It's something you can go into. But if you're going into possession, these are the three shaman abilities you're really looking for overall. So there is that particular aspect. Now, an interesting thing to observe is that Entangling Vines converts your retaliation damage into attack here. So a lot of the times you will find Blood of Dreeg very useful as well. I don't know why I went all the way up there. And as a result, you'll probably find Dreeg's Evil Eye quite handy furthermore. So just have that awareness that Blood of Dreeg can do quite a bit more than you would normally expect in this combination, and Blood of Dreeg makes for an excellent choice here. So the second option you broadly are going to have in terms of building this class is the pet focus, which of course I have mentioned numerous times. This goes Primal Bond. Obviously you have physical, internal trauma, bleeding damage. This is a little bit more of an odd build. For Occultist, obviously you're still going to theoretically go into Bloody Pox, but what you go into after that really depends on if you want to emphasize elemental damage or if you want to emphasize bleeding damage or something. Because if you want to emphasize the elemental damage, then this is pretty much the only ability you'll grab other than Curse of Frailty, and if you're feeling really spicy, Vulnerability. That's a personal choice. But you'll at the very least want Curse of Frailty here. It reduces bleeding and physical resistance, and since you're going into pets, you're going to be doing some decent physical damage anyways. Now, if you are going to be going into that, you could go into Savagery with a physical-based weapon. You could. It's not super important, but it can be used. In this case, you may splash in some Soil's Witchfire for the attack speed, some random vitality increase. Not a bad idea. It's an option that you can think about. Brute Force is probably more likely where you're going to be going with this, because that's much more physical and internal trauma. Even more here. You've got some bleeding here. More here. Especially if you're using a physical weapon. Then you've got Primal Strike, which does bleeding, physical, lightning. This is actually really the only setup in which you can justify regular use of the lightning abilities, because they typically do physical and bleeding as well. The Grasping Vines, once again, is a pretty decent pickup here, because it's physical and bleeding. Even with the vitality damage later on, that's fine. Like I said, your Bloody Pox is already going to be doing that. Ironically, Devouring Swarm can still potentially be effective here, if you decide to go with the Grasping Vines, or splash in some lightning. Oddly enough, the pet build is the most diverse. Obviously, you want pets. You obviously want the Briarthorn. But which one of these two, if you decide not to go with both, or not to go full pets, you could just get the Briarthorn. Run the Primal Bond for the primarily physical internal trauma and bleeding bonuses to you. Obviously, you get your Briarthorn. Maybe you go for the Crow because it heals you. Maybe you want to summon Hellhound so that way you can use Sigil of Consumption plus Destruction to do some extra damage. I don't know. Typically, when I build pets with Shaman, I'll go with the Briarthorn, and I'll go with the Crow. I don't usually build Bonds of Bismuil. Every once in a while I will, but it's not very common, because I don't want to necessarily actually go all the way to the end here. I'll usually stop at 40, grab Black Death, because it's just very powerful. This also gives me access to any of these other abilities if I want. It gives me access to the full Crow. It gives me access to the Blood of Drieg if I want. This is probably, out of all of the pet builds that you will be able to find in these classes, this is the most improbable. And by that I mean you can pretty much do a whole lot of different things within this one pet build. How many pets you use is variable, which pets you use is variable, what supportive skills you want to use is completely up to you. You have a lot of really interesting options here, honestly, and it works out quite fantastically. This actually, just for the pure reasons of ease of improv, this is one of my favorite pet builds. Is this the best class combination for pets? Absolutely not. If you want to go 100% pets, you're going to be slapping a Necromancer in there somewhere. Let's be really honest. But if you are really afraid of going into a pet build and getting bored with it, this is the class you use. Because out of all of the pet builds that you can run, this one has the most potential skill diversity if you want it. Now there are a couple of things, actually now that we've covered the broad strokes of the builds that you can run, the rough ideas here, let's look at the 3 skills that are most useful out of the 2 different separate classes. Now for the Shaman, this is actually going to be something you'll find a tad bit surprising, but Devouring Swarm, Grasping Vines, and Savagery. Now Savagery is probably out of the 3 of these the one that will confuse you the most. However, keep in mind that this is doing increased weapon damage. Again, in case you haven't seen any of the other episodes out of this series, or you don't know, or you just weren't paying attention in the other episodes, 100% weapon damage is 100% of whatever damage that weapon does. Let's say you're equipped with a vitality damage weapon such as the Soleil's Morningstar, whatever they call those, the maces that the, technically they're scepters, that the cultists sometimes drop. Those do vitality damage, or you could pick up, say, maybe you pick up one of the Bloodsworn pistols that does chaos damage, if I'm remembering correctly. Whatever damage type that weapon does, Savagery is increasing. So even if you're not specifically looking to go into the lightning damage portion of Savagery, even if you're going with a possession build, Savagery can still pull some pretty good weight if you pick the right weapon to equip yourself with. Hands down. To some extent, this also does apply to Brute Force. This is absolutely true. But Brute Force does not incorporate quite as much weapon damage. This is a percentage chance to be used special attack, which does weapon damage. Upheaval is the same thing. This isn't necessarily going to always activate. It activates every so often. But Savagery is consistent. You hit somebody, you're doing 100%, actually at the end of this does more than 100%, you hit somebody, you're doing 50% extra of whatever damage type that is, plus bleeding, plus lightning. And furthermore, splashing in the lightning in a possession build allows you to get around a lot of your potential issues with most chthonic enemies. There will still be some chthonic enemies that are going to be resistant to your lightning damage, and your vitality damage, and your chaos damage. Whatever. The lightning will help you with most of these, and honestly, even then, you come over here, you get some attack speed, slap on Slail's Witchfire as well. Oof, you're doing a whole lot of whatever damage type you happen to be choosing to do. And even if your weapon only does physical damage, or even if your weapon only does bleeding damage, or whatever, if you equip Slail's Witchfire, that chaos damage, and later on, that vitality damage, is being added to your weapon. This here, and also if you're using a physical weapon, you can convert some of that into chaos damage with the Consecrated Blade if you're really desperate. And also you get a bonus to your pets, so you could splash a pet in if you really wanted to. But you have ways of adding chaos and vitality damage onto even a physical weapon. So don't sweat it too much. But these are definitely easily the three most useful. And even if you're going into, regardless of if you're going into possession or pets, Devouring Swarm can really pull its weight. Same thing with Grasping Vines. It does not matter which one of these rough build ideas or rough build directions that you're going in. Grasping Vines is a really strong skill, regardless of which way you're going. So for Shaman, these are going to be the three most useful, and the really nice thing about this is that these are all very early on in the class, and it doesn't take much to get to Entangling Vines or Storm Touched on only level 32, which isn't too bad. So if you're not looking to fully commit into the Shaman, you just splash in some points here, get about a third of the way up, and you're pretty much golden. For Occultist, the top three skills, you probably can see this one coming. Obviously, Bloody Pox. That goes pretty much without saying. Slail's Witchfire, again, you probably saw coming. That's fairly self-explanatory. And Blood of Dreeg. Now, I already explained part of the reason why Blood of Dreeg is something you'll generally want to be considering for most of your builds, but keep in mind that Blood of Dreeg is also the only non-enemy reliant self-heal that you're going to get your hands on. This is pretty big news. You get percentage of health restored here. I believe it ends up at 30 or something like that, 28%, which is a pretty good amount. And then you get your health regeneration increased, and if you go into Grasping Vines, you're going to boost that damage. You're going to get some nice vitality damage increase here if you're going into that. I mean, what's not to love here? Now, a close runner-up and an honorable mention is Curse of Frailty. The bleeding, the physical, if you're really going into that. The vulnerability is really nice as well. It's just a brief shout-out, but it's not top three. You won't necessarily always be considering this, but you'll always at least want to consider Blood of Dreeg for that delicious self-heal that doesn't rely on how much damage you're dealing to the enemy at the time. So, do keep that in mind. On top of that, we also have a couple of more specific ideas we can run here. Now, overall, the only thing you really won't be looking at, broadly speaking, is Stormcaller's Pact. This is about the only ability you will never want to be looking at, because, obviously, there's not a whole lot of opportunity for the Occultist to take advantage of this. If you are insistent on using Stormcaller's Pact here, then the only two things you'll be looking at will be the Crow and Slail's Witchfire. Possibly Blood of Dreeg for the self-heal, but that would be up to you, and I don't really see it being that useful. At the very least, you get some nice attack speed out of Slail's Witchfire, and it's the splashing in vitality and chaos damage, so that way you're not just standing there only doing lightning and barely any cold. So, and of course the Crow will heal you, give you elemental damage increases, do its own lightning damage. It has options, but this is about the only thing you would just go with the Summon Familiar if you're going into the Stormcaller's Pact. It's not like it's impossible to make it work, it's not like it's always going to be trash or whatever. It's just, keep in mind that it's just, you're going to be pulling very little from the Occultist side of things, and even then, only about half of the Shaman side is going to be picked up. You're going to be building Brute Force over here, you're going to be building Primal Strike, Savagery, Wind Devil, and Storm Totem. That's all really your options will come down to. So, and of course, like I said before, you can absolutely go with the 100% pet build here, go with these, and then you come over here, you go into the Crow, the Hellhound, Bonds of Bismiel, and it's just magical time. You go into Bloody Pox, if you can. Go into, actually, Grasping Vines would be a little bit better. It fits more effectively, but it doesn't have the percentage of health damage of Bloody Pox, so that's really a personal choice you would have to make. But you gotta think about it. But you have a lot of options to readjust or completely flip your pet build on its head if you really want to. So overall, this is a bit of a shorter video because this is somewhat of a restrained combination. There's only, like I said, 2 broad ways of building this. Now, there's a lot of diversity within those 2 broad build paths, which is why I describe them as broad build paths. But at the end of the day, you're either looking to splash in or completely focus on pets, or you're looking to focus 100% on yourself. That's basically what it comes down to. So, you know, it is somewhat limited. However, I actually would like to deal with another factor here, and that is that I forgot to mention a specific build that I was recapping my everything. I forgot to mention an extremely specific build somebody asked me about, but I did not actually discuss. And that's on me. That is shame on me. But it is a focus on Eye of Reckoning. And somebody asked me to cover the devastating Eye of Reckoning build, specifically, when I got to this combination, and I totally forgot. I will add this also in the description of that video, but I wanted to take a moment to at least verbally cover this. Now, what makes this build, theoretically, so incredibly potent is 2 things. First off, as long as you have the energy, you're spinning. This is the spin to win build. Now, on the surface, it doesn't look like it hits that often, but you're talking about Eye of Reckoning dealing damage every 0.16 seconds. Now, if you're curious, oh, what's the actual math on that? You're hitting an enemy 6.25 times, or we're just going to round down to 6 times a second. So that can be some pretty substantial amounts of damage per, because DPS, damage per second, that can be quite substantial if you're hitting 6 times per second. And furthermore, and this is the really big clincher, 15% reduced target's damage for 2 seconds. So everyone you're hitting is doing 15% less damage. This makes it much harder to kill you. There are a couple of different ways. Now, this isn't the only combination. Shieldbreaker is not the only combination that can make this work. Some honorable mentions would be Arcanist, which I'll talk about specifically when that rolls around, and also Shaman, but again, we haven't gotten to that specific combination. But I'll cover this a little bit in this video because we do only have the 15 minutes. Now, when you're running Eye of Reckoning, you really have a strong... You're really primarily going to be looking to increase the sort of elemental side of things because it does a little bit more elemental damage, but that's totally up to you, really, if you want to. But you are going to be focusing on some very specific things here. I'm trying to find... Yes, so what you're going to want to build specifically is Safeguard, Divine Mandate. Alright. You actually don't go all the way up here. What you build very specifically, I pulled out too many points here. Then you build Vindictive Flame. Now you might be mildly confused, but the point of Vindictive Flame and Olzwin's Wrath is not only will the Soulfire be reducing target's damage, but you will be doing retaliation damage as they're slapping you. You are also able to move faster with Vindictive Flame. Now, the reason why we're going all the way to Olzwin's Wrath is because this is also going to hit people that are attacking you from a farther distance, and you'll notice 22% reduced target's damage. You're now reducing enemy damage by 37% consistently, because even though each one of these effects lasts 2 to 3 seconds, depending on the ability, you're doing it so consistently, so often, that it'll guaranteed be triggering all the time. Now, next off, you obviously want to at least do Flame Touch. Now, whether or not you go into Temper is entirely up to you. It does increase the damage, but it is not hyper important that you have this. It's, again, really up to you. It's a personal choice kind of thing. I usually do, in all honesty. Now, I usually build Resilience just for the healing effect increases. You've got your physical resistance. You know, it just can keep you alive, really. And also, we have Ascension that I usually do as well. I'll activate this if I'm dying, but it really depends. Sometimes I don't really have the focus to use that, Presence of Virtue is just always on, and tends to also be very useful as well. And increases your physical damage. I always forget this increases physical damage because it's such a small amount, but, you know. So you do have that as well. Finally, if you really want to finish things up with class, the Guardian of Empyrean with Celestial Presence, you absolutely want, because that's going to reduce the physical and fire resistance of your enemies. The bleeding resistance, we don't really care about, honestly. It doesn't matter. At this point, you have a spare 2 points. Just throw them into whatever. You want to throw them into demolitions for those specific stats, that's fine. That's usually what I do. It's pretty much whatever. But this setup here is going to do you the most damage, will keep you alive a pretty good amount of time, and it is pretty fun. My only issue, really, with the build, and this is why I always forget this, yes, it's devastatingly powerful, especially if you equip the right items. The itemization is going to be somewhat flexible because it depends on what items you want, what the passive abilities of those items are, etc. I'm not going to get into the items here, the itemization of this build. I just wanted to talk about the actual skills that you use here. But my only issue with this is that it can get rather boring at some point because you're only using really the one ability. There's not really much point. I have seen people, instead of going into Presence of Virtue, they go into Vire's Might, so that way they can dash into a group of enemies and then they start spinning to win. It is an option. It is an option. But overall, I just find the repetitive use of the one skill to be somewhat unexciting for me personally. Now, that's not to say that I haven't ever built the skill before. I build the skill occasionally, but I don't usually do the spin to win build itself, because it's only the one activatable ability, really. You summon your guardians, you activate your ascension, and you spin. I'm sorry, I forgot you also activate your flame touch. But then after that, you just spin, and you spin some more. Effective, yes, but exciting? No. It isn't. I mean, there are some people who, I know for a fact there are some players who do want that consistent repetition. I have no problem with that. If that's for you, more power to you. You are a much more stable person than I am. And there are some people who just use this to farm, because they can just hold down the button, direct themselves a little bit, and they can either watch another video, because you don't need a whole lot of attention with this build, or they'll listen to something, or they'll listen to their favorite podcast or whatever. Totally up to you. So it does have certain advantages in that particular aspect, and I will freely concede that if I ever just wanted to shut off my mind and kind of mindlessly grind out some items, and I wanted to do something else at the same time, this is the build you do it with. It's effective, it keeps you alive, it hits really hard, and you don't need to pay that much attention to it. So it does have some advantages, but this is not a build that I go to necessarily when I want to sit down and enjoy some Grim Dawn. This is something that I would recommend for farming. Obviously, you have to get a character up there. That goes without saying. But you don't necessarily have to build the character up using just this build. You can always adjust your skill points after the fact once you get the character to level 100. Actually, frankly, you don't even technically need to get the character to level 100. You can get them to 98 and be totally fine. Actually, yeah. No, 98 is where it goes. So, I mean, at that point, that's really where this build shines. You want to farm? You want to farm and listen to something else? Or watch something else? Spin to win. Do it. You'll love it. But if you want to have a fantastically amazing time full of diverse abilities and grand fights, this is not this is not the build. But again, there are some people who are really looking for that consistency anyways, and this is the most consistent thing you can get your hands on. So this was a bit of a weird episode, and I apologize for forgetting to mention this very specifically. That is on me. So thank you all very much for watching. If you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, or suggestions, please leave them down in the comments below. And thank you all very much for joining me, and have a great 24 hours.